Tamara Wilson glanced at her watch as she walked briskly through the busy airport terminal. She had plenty of time before her flight to Chicago, but years of working as a Federal Aviation Administration inspector had taught her to always arrive early. The terminal buzzed with the usual energy of travelers rushing to gates, families saying goodbyes, and airport staff directing the flow of people. After 15 years with the FAA, Tamara had seen it all. Today she was traveling back from an undercover assessment at a regional airport. Just another day in her job making sure airlines followed safety and service regulations. She wore comfortable jeans, a simple navy sweater, and practical walking shoes. Her curly hair was pulled back in a neat ponytail, and she carried a small carry-on suitcase that had accompanied her on hundreds of flights. The overhead announcements echoed through the terminal as Tamara approached Gate C-17. A line of passengers had already formed, boarding passes and IDs in hand. She took her place in line, scrolling through work emails on her phone while she waited. The gate agent, a young man with slicked back hair and a crisp uniform, processed passengers with mechanical efficiency. "Next, please," he called, barely looking up from his computer. When Tamara reached the front of the line, she handed over her boarding pass with a friendly smile. "Good afternoon." The gate agent took her boarding pass but paused as his eyes moved from the document to Tamara herself. His gaze lingered on her jeans, then her shoes, then back to her face. His eyebrows rose slightly. "I'm sorry, ma'am, but I can't let you board," he said, his voice taking on an official tone. Tamara blinked, caught off guard. "Excuse me?" "Your attire doesn't meet our proper passenger appearance standards," he said, handing back her boarding pass. "Especially for first class." Tamara looked down at her clothes, then at the passengers who had just boarded ahead of her, several of whom wore similar casual outfits. A white businessman in jeans and a polo shirt had just walked through the gate without issue. A white woman in yoga pants and a sweatshirt had boarded moments before. "I don't understand," Tamara said calmly. "What exactly is the problem with my appearance?" The gate agent sighed as if he was dealing with a difficult customer. "Ma'am, we have standards for passengers, particularly in first class. Your current attire isn't appropriate for today's flight." Tamara felt a familiar tightness in her chest, a feeling she'd experienced many times before in situations like this. But years of dealing with airline staff had taught her to stay composed. As an FAA inspector, she was trained to observe and document, not to react emotionally. "Can you show me where these appearance standards are listed in your airline's policy?" she asked. "I've flown with your airline many times dressed exactly like this." Behind her, other passengers began to shift uncomfortably. Some avoided eye contact while others watched with open curiosity. A few tapped on their phones, perhaps messaging about the delay. "Look, I don't make the rules," the gate agent said, his voice rising slightly. "If you'd like to change into more appropriate attire, you're welcome to take a later flight." Tamara noticed a pattern forming, one she'd seen countless times during her inspections. The gate agent's eyes kept darting to other passengers waiting in line, his impatience growing visibly. Yet she also noticed how he smiled warmly at a white family approaching the gate, nodding approvingly as they passed by with their boarding passes, despite the father wearing worn jeans and a faded t-shirt. "I'd like to speak with your supervisor." "Please," Tamara said, keeping her voice steady and professional. The gate agent's jaw tightened. "That's going to delay the boarding process." "I understand, but I still need to speak with your supervisor." With obvious reluctance, the agent picked up a phone and pressed a button. "I need a supervisor at Gate C-17, he said quietly. Then, turning to the line of waiting passengers, he announced, "Folks, we'll continue boarding in just a moment. Thank you for your patience." Several passengers sighed or checked their watches. One woman with a stroller moved to sit down again, shaking her head. Tamara stood to the side, watching as the boarding process continued for everyone else. She noticed how the gate agent carefully examined her boarding pass again, as if looking for any reason to justify his decision. 5 minutes passed, then 10. The boarding line dwindled as more passengers filed through the gate. Tamara remained where she was, standing calmly but firmly. She pulled out her phone and made a brief note of the time and the gate agent's name badge, not for show but as part of her habitual documentation. In her years as an inspector, she'd learned that details mattered. Finally, a man in a dark suit approached the gate. His name tag identified him as Philip, customer service supervisor. He spoke briefly with the gate agent, who pointed discreetly toward Tamara. Philip nodded and approached her with a practiced smile. "Good afternoon, ma'am. I understand there's an issue with your boarding today?" "Yes," Tamara replied. "Your gate agent has refused to let me board, claiming my appearance doesn't meet your airline standards. I've asked to see this policy in writing, but he hasn't provided it." Philip glanced at her outfit, then at her boarding pass. "I see you're in first class," he noted, his tone suggesting this was relevant to the situation. "Yes, I am," Tamara confirmed. "Is there a separate dress code for first-class passengers that I'm not aware of?" Philip cleared his throat. "We do expect a certain level of presentability from our premium passengers. It helps maintain the experience for everyone." "And what about those passengers?" Tamara asked quietly, nodding toward a group who had just boarded. "All white, all dressed casually, some even in shorts and flip-flops despite the cool autumn weather. They seemed to be dressed very similarly to me, yet they boarded without issue." Philip shifted his weight from one foot to the other. "Every situation is different, ma'am. Our staff has to make judgment calls." "Based on what criteria?" Tamara pressed. "Look," Philip said, his professional demeanor slipping slightly, "we have the right to enforce certain standards. If you'd like to file a complaint, you're welcome to contact our customer service department after your trip. But right now I need to finish the boarding process." Tamara noticed a few passengers had paused to watch the interaction. One woman had her phone held at an angle that suggested she might be recording. Tamara didn't mind. Documentation worked both ways. "I'll be happy to let you complete the boarding process," Tamara said evenly. "As soon as I'm allowed to board my flight, as my ticket entitles me to do." Philip's smile tightened. "Ma'am, you're causing a scene." "I'm standing here speaking to you in a normal tone of voice," Tamara replied. "I haven't raised my voice or made any demands beyond being treated like the other passengers." A final boarding call came over the loudspeaker. The gate area had nearly emptied now, with just a handful of stragglers rushing toward the gate. Philip looked increasingly uncomfortable. "This is your final opportunity to board this flight," he said, "but I'm going to have to insist that in the future, you dress more appropriately when flying with us." Tamara felt a flash of anger, but kept her expression neutral. Throughout her career, she'd encountered this kind of treatment more times than she could count. Sometimes she was traveling as herself, sometimes undercover as part of an assessment. Either way, the pattern was familiar, and exactly why the FAA conducted these reviews. She could have shown her FAA credentials right away. She could have watched them scramble to apologize, suddenly finding her appearance perfectly acceptable. But that wasn't the point of today's assessment. The point was to observe how airlines treated ordinary passengers, particularly those who might face discrimination. "What specifically about my appearance is inappropriate?" Tamara asked, looking directly into Philip's eyes. "I'd like you to explain it to me clearly." Philip looked at the gate agent, then back at Tamara. The final passengers were boarding now. In moments, they would close the door. "Your overall presentation just doesn't meet our standards," he said vaguely. "Now, are you going to board, or shall I have your luggage removed from the aircraft?" Tamara felt all eyes on her. The remaining passengers watched with uncomfortable expressions. The gate agent looked smug, as if he'd been vindicated by his supervisor's support. She had a choice to make. She could reveal her identity now and watch them backpedal frantically, or she could let this play out fully, documenting every moment of the discriminatory treatment to include in her report. Both approaches had value from an inspection standpoint. What they didn't realize was that every word, every look, every double standard was being mentally recorded by someone whose job was to ensure fairness in air travel, someone who had the power to hold them accountable. Tamara took a deep breath and reached for her bag, her decision made. The clock on the wall showed that the scheduled departure time was just minutes away. The final boarding call echoed through the nearly empty gate area. And still, Tamara Wilson stood there, a Federal Aviation Administration inspector whose identity remained hidden, for now. Tamara stood her ground at gate C-17, her carry-on bag beside her. The busy airport terminal had quieted as most passengers had already boarded the Chicago-bound flight. Only she remained at the gate, facing Philip the supervisor and the gate agent whose name tag read David. "I'll ask one more time," Tamara said, her voice calm but firm. "What specific part of your dress code am I violating?" "I'd like to see this policy in writing." Philip crossed his arms. Ma'am, this isn't a courtroom. We don't need to provide written evidence of our policies. As I've explained, our gate agents have discretion in these matters. Discretion based on what? Tamara pressed. She glanced around, noticing a few curious onlookers from nearby gates watching the scene unfold. A cleaning crew member had slowed her work, clearly listening while pretending to wipe down seats. Based on maintaining our standards, Philip replied, his patience visibly wearing thin. Now the aircraft door is about to close. Will you be changing your outfit and taking a later flight? Or shall I have your checked luggage removed? Tamara took a slow breath. In her 15 years as an FAA inspector, she'd witnessed countless interactions between airline staff and passengers. She'd seen the subtle and not-so-subtle ways certain passengers were treated differently. Today was no exception, but she wasn't just observing. She was experiencing it firsthand. I find it interesting, she said carefully, that passengers wearing similar or even more casual clothing boarded without issue. The only difference I can see is, that's enough, Philip cut her off sharply. I won't stand here and listen to accusations. We treat all our passengers equally. A woman waiting at the neighboring gate had her phone pointed in their direction now, not even trying to hide that she was recording. Tamara noticed but kept her focus on Philip. I'm not making accusations, she said. I'm stating what I observed. If your dress code is applied inconsistently, that's something your airline might want to address. David, the gate agent, leaned toward Philip and whispered something. Philip nodded and then turned back to Tamara. Look, maybe we got off on the wrong foot here, he said, his tone softening slightly. If you'd like to speak with our customer relations team, I can arrange that. But right now we have a plane full of passengers waiting to depart. And I have a ticket for that flight, Tamara replied. A first-class ticket that I paid for just like everyone else who boarded. A crackle came from the gate desk phone. David answered it, listened for a moment, then covered the mouthpiece. It's the captain, he told Philip, asking about the delay. Philip sighed heavily and walked over to take the phone. Tamara could hear fragments of his explanation. Passenger compliance issue and dress code violation. She noted how carefully he avoided mentioning anything about her appearance beyond her clothes, or any other characteristics that might suggest discriminatory treatment. While Philip spoke with the captain, Tamara pulled out her phone and took a few notes. She wasn't trying to be obvious about it, but David noticed. What are you doing? He asked, suspicion in his voice. Just making some notes about our conversation, Tamara said, for when I follow up with your customer relations team. David's eyes narrowed. Are you some kind of lawyer or something? No, Tamara said truthfully. I'm not a lawyer. Philip returned from the phone call, looking even more frustrated than before. The captain has given us 5 more minutes to resolve the situation before they pull back from the gate. That should be plenty of time for me to board, Tamara said. Philip's professional veneer cracked slightly. Ma'am, I don't think you understand. You are not boarding this flight unless you change your clothes. That's final. A small crowd had gathered now. Airport staff, passengers from nearby gates, even a gift shop employee on break. Tamara was aware of the audience, but kept her focus on the airline staff. This wasn't about creating a scene. It was about documenting a pattern of behavior that the FAA needed to address. I understand perfectly, Tamara said. What I don't understand is why the policy seems to apply only to me, and not to the other passengers I saw board in jeans, t-shirts, and even sweatpants. A woman in the small crowd called out. I was on that flight yesterday wearing yoga pants and nobody said a word. Philip shot an annoyed glance toward the onlookers. This is a private matter between our airline and this passenger. It doesn't seem very private now, Tamara observed. And it doesn't seem very consistent either. The phone at the gate desk rang again. David answered it, listening for just a moment before hanging up. 2 minutes, he told Philip. Tamara could see the stress building in Philip's face. Sweat had formed on his forehead, and he kept glancing at the growing crowd of spectators. What had started as a quiet denial of boarding was becoming a public relations problem right before his eyes. I'm going to ask you one last time, Philip said, lowering his voice. Please step aside so we can close this flight. And I'm going to ask you one last time, Tamara replied, matching his quiet tone. What specific policy am I violating that those other passengers were not? An older airport security officer had wandered over, watching the scene with interest but not intervening. Tamara noted his presence, another witness to what was unfolding. Philip looked at David, then back at Tamara. He seemed to be weighing his options, perhaps realizing that the situation had escalated beyond a simple boarding denial. "Our first-class cabin has certain standards," he finally said. "The other passengers you mentioned were in economy." Tamara raised an eyebrow. "That's not true. I watched at least 3 passengers in jeans and casual tops scan first-class boarding passes right before me." "How would you know that?" David interjected. "Because I was standing right here watching," Tamara said simply. "Just like I watch everything that happens at airports. It's a professional habit." Something in her tone made both men exchange glances. "What exactly do you do for work, ma'am?" Philip asked, a new note of caution in his voice. Tamara considered her response carefully. She hadn't planned to reveal her identity during this assessment. The purpose was to experience the airline's treatment of passengers as an ordinary traveler would. But the situation had reached a point where a decision needed to be made. Before she could answer, the phone rang again. This time, when David picked it up, his face fell. "They're closing the door," he announced to Philip. "Captain's orders." Philip seemed almost relieved. "I'm sorry, ma'am, but it appears the decision has been made for us." "The flight is now closed," Tamara nodded slowly. "I see, and my luggage?" "Will be removed and available for you to collect at baggage services," Philip said. "Now, if you'd like to rebook on a later flight with appropriate attire, our customer service desk can assist you." The crowd that had gathered began to disperse. The momentary drama apparently concluded. The woman who had been filming put her phone away. The security officer lingered, perhaps making sure the situation wouldn't escalate further. Tamara picked up her carry-on bag. "Before I go to customer service, I'd like both of your full names and employee IDs, please." David looked to Philip, who forced a tight smile. "That won't be necessary. If you have a complaint, you can file it through proper channels." "I insist," Tamara said, taking out her notepad again. "This interaction will need to be documented thoroughly." "Documented for what?" Philip asked, his professional tone slipping again. "Look, if you're planning some kind of social media campaign or lawsuit, you should know that our actions are fully supported by company policy." Tamara wrote something in her notepad, then looked up at them both. "I'm not interested in social media. I'm interested in accountability." There was something in her steady gaze that finally seemed to unsettle them. The confidence with which she stood, the methodical way she took notes, the calm in the face of their increasing discomfort. It all hinted at someone who knew exactly what she was doing. "Who are you?" David blurted out, unable to contain his curiosity any longer. Tamara zipped her bag and straightened her shoulders. The question hung in the air between them. She could see the first flickers of doubt in their expressions, the dawning realization that perhaps they had misjudged the situation badly. "Someone who notices things," she replied simply, "like how certain passengers are treated differently than others, like how policies seem to change depending on who they're applied to." Philip's phone buzzed in his pocket. He checked it, his face growing pale as he read the message. "Excuse me for a moment," he said to Tamara, stepping aside to make a call. David stood awkwardly at the gate desk, stealing glances at Tamara as she continued making notes in her small pad. The once busy gate area was nearly empty now, the flight to Chicago presumably pushing back from the gate. Philip returned a minute later, his demeanor completely transformed. The confident supervisor was gone, replaced by someone who looked like he'd just received troubling news. "Ms. Wilson," he said, using her name for the first time. "There seems to have been a misunderstanding." Tamara looked up from her notepad. "Has there?" "Yes," Philip continued, his voice now carefully controlled. "I've just been informed that we may have overlooked some information about your reservation." "What information would that be?" Tamara asked, though she suspected she knew exactly what had happened. Someone higher up in the airline had finally realized who she might be. Her name had triggered an alert in their system, too late for this flight but in time for the airline to start damage control. Philip cleared his throat. "Perhaps we could continue this conversation somewhere more private?" Tamara glanced around the nearly empty gate area. A few airport staff still lingered nearby, and the woman who had been recording earlier was pretending to check her phone while clearly still watching the situation unfold. "I think we've had enough privacy for our conversation," Tamara replied to Philip's suggestion. "Unless there's something you'd prefer others not hear?" Philip shifted uncomfortably. Ms. Wilson, I've just received some information about you that I think changes the nature of our interaction here. What information would that be? Tamara asked, though she already knew. Someone in the airline system had finally run a deeper check on her name and discovered her position with the Federal Aviation Administration. David, the gate agent, was looking increasingly nervous. He leaned toward Philip and whispered, "What's going on?" Philip ignored him, focusing entirely on Tamara. "Perhaps we could start fresh? I believe there may have been a misunderstanding about our dress code policy." "A misunderstanding?" Tamara repeated slowly. "Just minutes ago, you were quite clear that I couldn't board because my appearance didn't meet your standards. What's changed?" The phone at the gate desk rang again. David answered it, listened for a moment, then held it out to Philip with a shaking hand. "It's Mr. Henderson from corporate." Philip took the phone, turning slightly away from Tamara. "Yes, sir. Yes, she's still here. No, the flight has already—" "Yes, sir. I understand. Right away, sir." He handed the phone back to David, his face now noticeably pale. "Ms. Wilson," Philip said, turning back to Tamara with a completely different demeanor. "On behalf of the airline, I want to sincerely apologize for the inconvenience today. There has clearly been a mistake in how our policies were applied in your case." "A mistake," Tamara said evenly. "And what exactly was that mistake?" Philip glanced at David, then back at Tamara. "Our dress code is meant to be applied fairly and consistently to all passengers. It appears that didn't happen here." "I see," Tamara said. "And why do you think that is?" Philip swallowed hard. I wouldn't want to speculate." "Then let me be direct," Tamara said, her voice still calm but with an edge of authority that hadn't been there before. "I watched as multiple passengers dressed similarly to me boarded without issue. The only visible difference between us was the color of our skin. Would you agree with that observation?" David's eyes widened. Philip's professional mask slipped completely. "Ms. Wilson, I want to assure you that our airline does not discriminate based on race or any other protected characteristic," Philip said quickly, sounding like he was reciting a policy manual. "If that was your perception of what happened here, I deeply apologize." "My perception," Tamara repeated. She opened her bag and pulled out a small leather wallet. "Let me share another perception with you." She flipped open the wallet to reveal her Federal Aviation Administration credentials, complete with her photo, name, and title. Senior Aviation Safety Inspector. The effect was immediate. David actually took a step back from the desk. Philip's mouth opened, then closed, then opened again without any words coming out. I had no idea," he finally managed to say. "That was rather the point," Tamara replied. "The FAA regularly conducts assessments of airline compliance with federal regulations, including those prohibiting discriminatory practices. Sometimes we identify ourselves up front. Other times we experience your service as any other passenger would." She let that sink in for a moment before continuing. "Today, I was traveling back from conducting an assessment at another airport. I wasn't planning to evaluate your airline's practices. I was simply going home. But then this happened." The remaining onlookers had inched closer, sensing that the dynamic had shifted dramatically. The woman with the phone was definitely recording again. "Ms. Wilson," Philip said, his voice now barely above a whisper, "I want to assure you that this incident doesn't reflect our airline's values or policies." "Actually," Tamara said, "that's exactly what it reflects. Not the policies you have written down, perhaps, but the ones you actually enforce. Not the values you claim in your mission statement, but the ones demonstrated by your actions." She closed her credential wallet and returned it to her bag. "The flight has already departed," she continued. "So let's discuss what happens next." Philip looked like he might be sick. "Of course. Whatever you need. We can get you on the next flight to Chicago. First class, of course, no charge. And we'll provide compensation for your inconvenience." "I'm not interested in compensation," Tamara said. "I'm interested in accountability and change." She pulled out her notepad again. "Here's what's going to happen. I'll be filing an official report about this incident with the FAA's Office of Civil Rights. This report will detail how your gate agent and you as a supervisor denied me boarding based on subjective application of a dress code policy that was not enforced consistently across passengers." David looked at Philip with panic in his eyes. "Additionally," Tamara continued, I'll be recommending that the FAA conduct a thorough review of your airline's training procedures and policy implementation, particularly regarding non-discrimination compliance. A man in a suit appeared at the edge of the gate area. From his anxious expression and the way he was hurrying toward them, Tamara guessed he was likely a higher-level manager who had been called down to deal with the situation. "Ms. Wilson," the man said as he approached, slightly out of breath. "I'm Thomas Reeves, station manager. I've just been briefed on the situation, and I want to personally apologize for what's happened here today." Tamara nodded in acknowledgement but continued speaking to Philip and David. "The FAA takes these matters very seriously. Airlines are required by federal law to provide service in a non-discriminatory manner." Thomas Reeves stepped in. "Ms. Wilson, I can assure you that we take this just as seriously. What happened here today was a failure on our part, and we are committed to addressing it immediately." "I'm glad to hear that," Tamara said, "because my next stop will be to meet with your diversity and inclusion team. I'd like to understand what training your frontline staff receives on unconscious bias and equitable treatment of passengers." Thomas looked stunned for a moment, then quickly composed himself. "Of course. I'll arrange that meeting right away. In the meantime, we'll get you on the next flight to Chicago, which leaves in about an hour." "Thank you," Tamara said. "And I'd like a copy of your airline's dress code policy, the actual written policy, not just what your staff thinks it is." "Absolutely," Thomas agreed quickly. "Philip, please get Ms. Wilson a copy of our appearance standards right away." Philip nodded, still looking shell-shocked, and hurried over to the gate computer. David, who had been silent since the revelation of Tamara's identity, finally spoke up. "Ms. Wilson, I want to apologize personally for my part in this. I didn't realize that I was an FAA inspector," Tamara finished for him. "That's precisely the problem, isn't it? No passenger should be treated the way I was today, regardless of who they are or what position they hold." David looked down, unable to meet her gaze. Thomas Reeves stepped in again. "Ms. Wilson, if you'll come with me, I'd like to personally escort you to our premium lounge while we prepare for your next flight." "Thank you, but that won't be necessary," Tamara said. "What I'd like instead is to observe your boarding process for the next Chicago flight. As an FAA inspector, I'm now officially expanding my assessment to include your gate operations." Thomas paled slightly but nodded. "Of course, whatever you need." The small crowd that had gathered began to disperse, but not before several people gave Tamara approving nods or small smiles of support. The woman who had been recording put her phone away and approached. "Excuse me," she said to Tamara. "I just wanted to say thank you. I've seen this happen to people before, and usually there's nothing they can do about it." Tamara smiled at her. "There's always something that can be done. Sometimes it just takes persistence." As the woman walked away, Philip returned with a printout of the airline's dress code policy. Tamara took it and scanned the document quickly. As she suspected, nowhere did it mention specific restrictions that would have applied to her outfit, but not to the similar outfits worn by other passengers. "Interesting," she said, tucking the policy into her bag. "This will be helpful for my report." Thomas Reeves checked his watch. "The next Chicago flight begins boarding in 40 minutes at gate C-22. I'll personally oversee the process to ensure everything goes smoothly." "I appreciate that," Tamara said. "But to be clear, I don't want special treatment now. I want equal treatment for everyone, always." "That's the point of these regulations," Thomas nodded, understanding dawning in his eyes. "Of course." Tamara picked up her carry-on bag. "Now, I believe you mentioned your diversity and inclusion team. I'd like to meet with them before my flight." As they walked away from gate C-17, Tamara glanced back one last time. David was sitting at the gate desk, head in his hands. Philip was on the phone, likely explaining to someone higher up exactly how they had managed to deny boarding to a federal inspector conducting an assessment of their airline's compliance with non-discrimination laws. The irony wasn't lost on Tamara. She hadn't boarded today's flight as planned, but she had certainly learned everything she needed to know about this airline's practices. And now they were going to learn something too, that accountability wasn't just a corporate buzzword. It was federal law. The news spread through the airport like wildfire. By the time Tamara reached the airline's administrative offices, escorted by Thomas Reeves, staff members were already looking at her with a mixture of curiosity and apprehension. Word traveled fast in airports, and the story of an FAA inspector being denied boarding because of her appearance had quickly become the talk of every break room and staff corridor. Thomas led Tamara into a conference room where 3 people were already waiting. They stood as she entered, their faces a blend of professional composure and underlying anxiety. "Ms. Wilson, this is Diane Chen, our Regional Director of Customer Experience," Thomas said, gesturing to a middle-aged woman in a tailored suit. "And this is Luis Hernandez, our Diversity and Inclusion Coordinator, and Pat Thompson from our Training Department." Tamara shook hands with each of them, noting their nervous smiles and overly firm handshakes. These weren't the gate-level employees who had discriminated against her. These were the people responsible for ensuring those employees were properly trained and held accountable. "Thank you for meeting with me on such short notice," Tamara said as she took a seat at the conference table. "I understand this is an unusual situation." Diane Chen spoke first. "Ms. Wilson, on behalf of the entire airline, I want to express our deepest apologies for what happened today. It does not reflect our values or our policies." Tamara had heard variations of this statement countless times in her career. It was the standard corporate response when something went wrong. Claim it was an anomaly, not a reflection of the company's true nature. In her experience, however, these incidents rarely happened in isolation. "I appreciate that," Tamara replied, "but I'm less interested in apologies and more interested in understanding how this happened and what you're going to do to prevent it from happening again." Luis Hernandez cleared his throat. "We have a comprehensive diversity training program that all customer-facing staff are required to complete. The behavior you experienced today is completely contrary to that training. When was the last time your gate agents received this training?" Tamara asked. Luis glanced at Pat Thompson, who quickly flipped through some papers. "All staff complete the training during onboarding, and then there's a refresher course annually." "And what does this training cover specifically regarding appearance-based discrimination?" Tamara pressed. A moment of uncomfortable silence followed. Pat Thompson looked down at her notes again, but it was clear she didn't have a ready answer. "Our training covers all forms of potential discrimination," Diane Chen said, stepping in, "including race, gender, disability, age, and appearance. Yet today I watched as passengers with nearly identical clothing to mine were allowed to board without question. While I was singled out," Tamara said. "What do you think that suggests about the effectiveness of your training?" None of them had a good answer for that. Thomas Reeves, who had been standing near the door, moved to take a seat at the table. "Ms. Wilson, it's clear we have a gap between our policies and their implementation," he admitted. "What would you recommend we do to address this?" It was the first honest question Tamara had heard since the incident began. Not an excuse or a deflection, but a genuine request for input. "First, I need to understand your current process," she replied. "When a passenger is denied boarding for a dress code violation, what documentation is required?" Pat Thompson answered this one. "The gate agent is supposed to note the specific violation in the passenger's reservation record and inform a supervisor." "And is there any review process for these decisions?" Tamara asked. "Any way to track patterns in who gets flagged for these violations?" Another uncomfortable silence fell over the room. The answer was clearly no. "I thought as much," Tamara said. She pulled out her notepad and began writing. "Here's what's going to happen. As I mentioned earlier, I'll be filing an official report with the FAA about today's incident. That will trigger a formal review of your airline's compliance with federal non-discrimination regulations." The executives exchanged worried glances. "However," Tamara continued, "the FAA's approach isn't just punitive. We're interested in improving industry practices, so I'm going to make some recommendations that, if implemented promptly, could help mitigate the consequences of today's incident." She turned to a fresh page in her notepad. "First, I want to see data on all passengers denied boarding for dress code violations in the past 12 months, broken down by race, gender, and age. That will tell us if today was truly an anomaly or part of a pattern." Diane Chen nodded. "We can have that for you by tomorrow." "Second, I want your dress code policy rewritten with clear, objective criteria that eliminate subjective judgments. No more vague terms like appropriate appearance or proper attire. If you can't define it specifically, you can't enforce it fairly." Luis Hernandez made a note on his tablet. "That makes sense. Third, I want to see your gate agents receive specialized training on bias-free decision-making. with specific scenarios addressing appearance-based judgments. And I want this training to be mandatory for all current staff within the next 30 days, not just included in annual refreshers. Pat Thompson looked concerned. That's a very tight timeline for our entire staff. It is, Tamara agreed. But so is the FAA's timeline for investigating discrimination complaints. I'm offering you a chance to be proactive rather than reactive. Finally, she turned to Thomas Reeves. And I want oversight. Every boarding denial needs to be documented with specific reasons and reviewed by management. Patterns need to be identified and addressed before they become problems. Thomas nodded slowly. These all sound like reasonable steps. Things we should have been doing already. Yes, Tamara said simply. They are. The room fell silent for a moment as the executives processed what she was asking and what was at stake. Diane Chen was the first to speak. We can implement all of these recommendations, she said, and we will. But I hope you understand that what happened today doesn't represent who we are as a company. Tamara looked at her steadily. Ms. Chen, in my 15 years with the FAA, I've learned that companies are defined by what they do, not by what they say they believe. Today, 2 of your employees showed me exactly who this airline is right now. The question is, who do you want to be tomorrow? Before Diane could respond, there was a knock at the conference room door. A young assistant poked her head in. I'm sorry to interrupt, but I thought you should see this. She held out a tablet to Thomas. He took it, his expression changing as he looked at the screen. Without a word, he passed it to Diane, who then passed it to Luis and Pat. What is it? Tamara asked. Thomas turned the tablet so she could see. On the screen was a social media post that had already gathered thousands of shares and comments. It showed a video of Tamara's confrontation with Philip and David at the gate. Along with the caption, "Black woman denied boarding for dress code violation, while white passengers in similar clothes allowed on. Watch until the end when she reveals she's an FAA inspector, flying while black, pure discrimination." The video had been posted less than an hour ago and was already going viral. It seems, Thomas said quietly, that the court of public opinion has already started its own review of our practices. Tamara wasn't surprised. She had noticed the woman recording, but her focus had been on documenting the incident for official purposes, not creating a social media moment. This changes things, Diane Chen said, her professional demeanor slipping slightly to reveal genuine concern. We need to issue a public statement immediately. Before you do, Tamara advised, I'd suggest you consider what actions you're going to announce along with your apology. People are tired of hollow statements. They want to see real change. Luis nodded in agreement. She's right. We need to be specific about what we're going to do differently. As the executives began discussing their response strategy, Tamara glanced at her watch. My flight to Chicago leaves soon. I should head to the gate. Thomas stood immediately. I'll escort you there myself. As they walked through the terminal toward gate C-22, Tamara could feel eyes on her. Some passengers were pointing discreetly, others were openly staring. The video was spreading and people were recognizing her from it. You're going to be famous by the time you reach Chicago, Thomas commented, noticing the attention. Tamara shook her head. That's not what this is about for me. I didn't set out to create a viral moment or embarrass your airline. I just wanted to be treated like everyone else. Thomas was quiet for a moment. I know. That's what makes this whole situation so much worse. When they reached gate C-22, Tamara saw that the boarding process was already underway. The gate agents, different ones from her earlier encounter, were checking boarding passes and allowing passengers through regardless of what they were wearing. Jeans, sweatpants, t-shirts, hoodies, all were passing through without comment. Your flight will begin boarding first-class passengers in about 5 minutes, Thomas said. Is there anything else you need? Tamara shook her head. Just a seat on the plane and equal treatment. That's all I ever wanted. Thomas nodded, looking genuinely remorseful. Ms. Wilson, for what it's worth, I believe this incident will change how we operate. Sometimes it takes a moment like this to force people to confront problems they've been ignoring. I hope you're right, Tamara said, because the next person who experiences discrimination might not have FAA credentials to make you listen. As Thomas walked away, Tamara's phone buzzed with an incoming call. It was her supervisor at the FAA. Hello, Tamara, he said when she answered. I just got a call from the airline's corporate office and I'm seeing a video that's making the rounds online. Sounds like you've had quite a day. You could say that, Tamara replied. It wasn't how I planned to conduct an assessment, but it turned out to be quite revealing. I imagine so, her supervisor said. I'm going to need a full report when you get back to the office tomorrow. You'll have it, Tamara promised, along with some recommendations for system-wide policy reviews that I think are long overdue. As she ended the call, the gate agent announced the beginning of first-class boarding. Tamara gathered her things and moved toward the gate, boarding pass in hand. This time, no one questioned her appearance or her right to be there. 3 months had passed since that day at gate C-17. Tamara Wilson stood at the airport security checkpoint, her FAA credentials displayed openly this time. Today wasn't about undercover assessment. It was about official follow-up. The incident had taken on a life of its own in the weeks after it happened. The video had been viewed millions of times, picked up by national news networks, and sparked yet another conversation about discrimination in everyday life. Tamara had declined most interview requests, preferring to let her work speak for itself. The viral fame wasn't what mattered to her. The changes it might bring were. As she made her way through the terminal, Tamara noticed subtle differences from her last visit. New signage displayed clearly written passenger rights information. Digital screens showed rotating messages about respect and inclusion. Small changes, perhaps, but visible ones. She reached gate C-17, the same gate where it had all happened, and found it busier than before. A group of airline staff stood near the desk, including a trainer working with 2 new gate agents. Tamara observed from a distance, watching their interactions with passengers. Inspector Wilson? Tamara turned to find Diane Chen, the regional director she had met 3 months ago, approaching with an extended hand. Ms. Chen. Tamara greeted her with a professional nod. Thank you for meeting me here, of course. We've been expecting you. Diane gestured toward the gate. As you can see, we've made some changes since your last visit. Tamara had already noticed the most obvious one. The diverse group of gate agents working together, carefully checking boarding passes without commenting on passengers' appearances. I see that, Tamara acknowledged, but I'm more interested in the changes I can't see. The policy changes, the training, the accountability measures. Diane nodded. We have a lot to show you. But first, there's someone who wanted to meet with you. She led Tamara to a small conference room near the gate area. Inside waited a young black woman Tamara didn't recognize, dressed in a crisp new airline uniform. This is Zoe Williams, Diane introduced her. She joined our team last month as part of our new hiring initiative. Zoe stood and extended her hand. It's an honor to meet you, Inspector Wilson. Your story is the reason I applied for this job. Tamara looked surprised. My story? Zoe nodded eagerly. When that video went viral, I was working retail. I'd always been interested in aviation, but never thought I'd fit in. Seeing how you stood your ground and then how the airline actually made changes afterward, it made me think maybe there was a place for me here after all. Tamara felt a warmth spread through her chest. This was an unexpected outcome. One person's career path changed because of what had happened. I'm glad something positive came from it for you, Tamara said, genuinely touched. After Zoe left to return to her training, Diane guided Tamara to a larger conference room where Luis Hernandez and Pat Thompson were waiting, along with several new faces. We've prepared a full briefing on the changes we've implemented, Luis began. But before we get into the details, I want to thank you, Inspector Wilson. Your visit, while initially uncomfortable for our organization, has been the catalyst for long overdue improvements. Tamara took a seat at the table. I appreciate that, but I'd rather focus on the specific actions you've taken since then. Pat Thompson slid a folder across the table. These are the results of our review of boarding denials for the past 3 years, broken down by demographics as you requested. Tamara opened the folder and scanned the data. The numbers confirmed what she had suspected. Passengers of color, particularly black women, had been disproportionately flagged for appearance-based violations. And what actions have you taken based on these findings? She asked. First, we've completely rewritten our dress code policy, Luis explained, handing her another document. As you can see, we've eliminated all subjective language. The only restrictions now are for safety reasons, proper footwear, no clothing with offensive language, that sort of thing. Tamara reviewed the new policy. It was indeed clearer and more objective than the previous version. Second, Pat continued, we've implemented a new training program focused specifically on recognizing and preventing bias in customer interactions. All frontline staff have completed it, and we've made it part of our regular training rotation. We've also added a review process, Diane added. Any boarding denial for any reason must be documented and reviewed by a supervisor in real time, with a secondary review by our compliance team within 24 hours. Tamara nodded approvingly. These were substantive changes, not just cosmetic ones designed for public relations purposes. What about Philip and David? She asked, referring to the supervisor and gate agent who had denied her boarding. The executives exchanged glances. Louis spoke first. They both went through our enhanced training program. David is still with the company, working in a different capacity where he's closely supervised. Philip chose to leave the airline. Tamara wasn't surprised. The video had shown both men clearly, and the public backlash had been significant. And the broader impact, she asked. Beyond just your airline? Diane smiled slightly. That's perhaps the most significant outcome. The FAA used our case as a basis for issuing new industry-wide guidance on non-discrimination in passenger services. Several other airlines have already reached out to us to learn from our experience and improve their own practices. This was what Tamara had hoped for, change that extended beyond one incident or one airline. She closed the folder and looked at the executives. I'll need to see these new procedures in action, she said. That's why I'm here today. I'll be observing your boarding processes, speaking with staff and reviewing how these policies are being implemented in real-world situations. Of course, Diane agreed. We've arranged for you to have full access to all areas and personnel. We have nothing to hide. For the rest of the day, Tamara moved through the airport watching and listening. She observed gate agents interacting with diverse passengers, noting how the new policies were being applied. She spoke with staff members about their experiences with the new training. She even reviewed records of recent boarding denials to ensure they were being properly documented and justified. By late afternoon, she found herself back at Gate C-17, watching as a flight to Chicago prepared for boarding. The gate area was crowded with travelers of all backgrounds, business people in suits, families in casual clothes, elderly passengers, young adults in trendy outfits. As boarding began, Tamara paid close attention to how the gate agents interacted with each person. What she saw encouraged her. Passengers were being processed efficiently and respectfully, with no comments about their appearance. When one traveler had an issue with their boarding pass, the agent handled it professionally, calling a supervisor who resolved the problem quickly without judgment or bias. As the last passengers boarded, Tamara made her final notes. The changes weren't perfect, no system ever is, but they represented real progress. Her incident had been painful and humiliating at the time, but it had sparked meaningful improvements that would benefit countless travelers in the future. Excuse me, are you Inspector Wilson? Tamara looked up to see an older woman standing nearby, her kind face etched with lines of experience. Yes, I am, Tamara acknowledged. The woman smiled. I thought I recognized you from the news. I just wanted to say thank you. My granddaughter saw your story, and it gave her courage to stand up when she faced discrimination at school. You showed her that sometimes you have to stand your ground even when it's hard. Tamara was momentarily speechless. The ripple effects of that day continued to surprise her. Thank you for telling me that, she finally said. It means a lot. After the woman walked away, Tamara gathered her things and headed toward the exit. Her official assessment was complete, and the report would be positive. The airline had taken concrete steps to address the issues she had identified, and early results showed improvement. But as she walked through the terminal, Tamara knew that the work wasn't really finished. One incident, one viral video, one policy change. These were just steps in a much longer journey. Real progress would come from the thousands of daily interactions where people were treated with dignity and respect, not because a camera was watching or an inspector was present, but because it was the right thing to do. Outside, the afternoon sun cast long shadows across the airport grounds. Tamara paused to enjoy the warmth on her face before heading to her car. Her phone buzzed with a message from her supervisor at the FAA. Your report from 3 months ago has led to new industry guidelines. Board meeting next week to discuss implementation. Well done, Tamara smiled as she read it. Sometimes change came from dramatic confrontations captured on video. Sometimes it came from quiet, persistent efforts behind the scenes. Both were necessary. Both mattered. As she drove away from the airport, Tamara thought about Zoe, the young woman who had found inspiration in her story. She thought about the grandmother whose granddaughter had found courage. She thought about all the travelers who might never know her name but would benefit from fairer treatment because she had stood her ground that day at Gate C-17. That was the real measure of progress. Not just changes in policy, but changes in people's lives. And for Tamara Wilson, FAA inspector, that made all the difference.